Hey there, Culture Gabfest listeners. Before we start the show, I want to let you know about a story coming up a little later. It's from one of our partners, SAP. AI comes at you fast. If you don't get reliable and relevant advice, your business might miss out. Whether you're looking to automate tasks or embed AI in your business processes, SAP can help. To learn more, head to sap.com/AI. And stick around for expert advice on how to embrace AI with confidence.
I'm Julia Turner, and this is the Slate Culture Gabfest Longlegs Has Legs edition. It's Wednesday, July 17th, 2024. On today's show, Longlegs, a freaky-deaky horror film featuring Nicolas Cage and a clever marketing campaign that drove big box office returns. America's Sweethearts, a behind-the-scenes documentary series starring the Dallas Cowboys Cheerleaders and their heartbreak and hot pants. And the devastating story of Alice Munro's daughter, Andrea Skinner, who was sexually abused by her stepfather, a crime that Munro ignored while remaining married to the perpetrator. Joining me today are Slate film critic Dana Stevens. Hello, Dana.
Hey. So good to have you back, Julia.
Yeah, thank you for holding down the fort during my travels. And critic Steve Metcalf. Hello.
Hey, Julia.
I'm so grateful to you guys for getting that time away with my fam. More on which later. Shall we dig in to Longlegs?
Let's dig.
All right. Longlegs is a horror film from Osgood Perkin, a director known both as the creator of indie horror gems like The Black Coat's Daughter and also for being the son of the actor Anthony Perkins, who famously played Norman Bates in Psycho. The film had a surprisingly strong return at the box office with a $22 million opening weekend that made it distributor Neon's strongest release ever. Before we dive into our discussion, let's listen to a clip. Most of the official clips here are ominous and wordless, so we're going to go with a segment of the trailer so you can get a sense of the tenor of the piece.
Is it scary being an FBI agent?
The letter was left with the bodies. We have 10 letters like it over the past 30 years, and all of them signed with one word: Longlegs.
He'll kill. And kill again.
Oh, there she is. You could have played nice with me, but you didn't.
Put the gun down!
And now that has led to all of this.
All right. Horror film, Nicolas Cage showcase, viral sensation. Dana, you're our film expert. What did you make of Longlegs?
Y'all, I can't wait to talk about this movie, but it's going to be really hard without spoiling because it's a movie that goes to unexpected places in the last act. Here's the first thing I will say, is that upon seeing Longlegs, I kind of couldn't believe that this was the horror movie that sold out the weekend, was number 2 at the box office, was, as you say, Julia, this viral sensation that everybody was talking about. It's been a while since there's been a sort of you gotta see it horror movie. It seems like Longlegs right now at the moment is shaping up to be that movie. And I was very, is that all there is coming out of this movie? I do not know about you guys, but I don't think I was ever genuinely scared, maybe sort of tense about when the next jump scare was coming. Like my body understood that scary signals were being created by the cinematography,
There's
music,
a book.
etc.
I want to see that on a poster.
But that is very different from, the deep psychological grip that a great horror movie should have on you. I will also say that it was interesting. I saw this with a bunch of members of my family. I had some out-of-town family visiting. So I had the rare treat of getting people to come with me to a horror movie. I happen to be married to someone who will not see anything scarier than, I don't know, The Wizard of Oz. The Witch in The Wizard of Oz is as scary as he wants to go. So I have years of experience now, decades of experience of going to very scary horror movies by myself. Having heard that this one was very scary, I was happy to have this gathering of family, including my daughter, around me to go see it. And I think among us, the two teenagers in the crowd were the most scared, maybe because they've seen the fewest horror movies, so I think maybe the stuff that's cliche worked a little better on them. Even they kind of agreed that once they walked out, they had forgotten about the movie already. But my daughter, who, as I've mentioned many times on the show, is an actor and a big connoisseur of acting, loved watching Nicolas Cage. He's not on screen very much. Is a little bit analogous maybe to the role Anthony Hopkins plays in Silence of the Lambs in the sense that he has relatively little screen time, but is this sort of terrifying off-screen presence. And he does his Nicolas Cage thing, which is, I have to say, the best and most interesting thing in the movie, because at least it bursts the boundaries of what the genre could be or is trying to be, whereas I felt that everything else was really, really cookie cutter. And when everything in a movie is trying to be scary, every shot, a person driving down the highway has to be filmed and scored in a creepy way. When everything's scary, nothing's scary.
Did they have to investigate everything at dusk? Like they were never like, it's noon, let's go check out the creepy farmhouse. They were like, wait for the gloaming, then drive.
Also, they're FBI agents without frickin' walkie-talkies. Like, there appear to only be 3 FBI agents in all of the Pacific Northwest in this film. Dana, I agree with everything you said, except one thing. It goes to totally expected places. I knew exactly the arc of this film within the first 5 or 10 minutes. I did not like this movie.
Well, I mean, only unexpected in that it becomes a different kind of horror movie than you thought it was
Fair
going
enough,
to be at the
but
beginning.
I think if you had asked me who's behind or who's this, I would have said almost all the stuff that comes in this totally crammed, packed full set of reveals at the end, which were preposterous. This is an affected nothing burger. Blair Witch was a marginally better film and was more formally daring, I think, and deserved maybe to be the viral hit that it was. But it sort of reminds me of that anticlimactic feeling of going in tingling and wanting a thrill ride and to be confronted with the dreadful aspects of human nature and walking out just kind of deflated. This to me is a dry erase board kind of movie. It's one of my least favorite kind of movies, and it shares unfortunate DNA with M. Night Shyamalan's movies. It feels reverse engineered from an absurd reveal backwards. The difference is, like, when M. Night makes a good movie like The Sixth Sense, all of the individual components that lead up to the great reveal have an independent sense of life to them. Like, there's a drama of loss and childhood wonder and dread in The Sixth Sense. It's a story of a mother who's despairing over a child she doesn't feel is normal. And it's actually, weirdly, a beautifully told film minus the reveal, which is an astonishing reveal. This doesn't have any of that. This film suffers, for me, particularly, for having been compared to Silence of the Lambs, which is one of the great genre novels ever written and one of the great genre pictures ever made, the Jonathan Demme film with Clarice Starling, played by Jodie Foster, and Hannibal Lecter by Hopkins. Compare the two, right? I agree that Nicolas Cage is the best thing about the movie, and it's sort of a wonderfully horrifying performance that doesn't make you think of the Nicolas Cage-ness of Nick Cage, which is its greatest achievement in some sense.
It has a lot of pathos, too.
Pathos and real terror, and there's an implication of why he ended up that way, and therefore there is one really interesting suggestion at the end of the film, which is how the cycle might perpetuate itself. That is the best part of the movie, but Lecter is one of the most fully, richly realized and written characters in all of genre fiction. And think about Clarice Starling. You sort of know who these people are. Who is this Lee Harker, who's the protagonist of the film? The actress, Micah Munro, who is in It Follows, gives an okay performance, but there's just nothing there on the page. This movie is boring. It has no forward propulsion. It is suffused with dread that doesn't pay off. I really didn't like it.
I am with you guys 100% on not liking it. And I think not liking it beyond my general dislike for horror movies, which I do go see for you all out there, dear listeners. But this one was hard to sit through on that front. But I did not like Nicolas Cage's performance, which I thought was histrionic and totally dread deflating. Like, I actually was, anxious, tense, wondering what was going to happen, wondering why Lee Harker is so weird. And I actually really enjoyed Micah Munro's performance, which I think, there's not that much on the page, but the way in which she makes the awkwardness of the character interpretable through multiple lenses, you're like, is she off because she's evil? Is she off because she's a victim? Is she off because she's just awkward? And the movie is lovely when it kind of plays her incredible awkwardness for laughs, which it does effectively a couple times in the early going. And then once you get to the reveal of Longlegs, it's just ridiculous. It's not
absurd.
Scary at all anymore.
No.
You're
Well,
like,
if
what
we can't do it here, but if you could just explain the actual MacGuffin behind the entire thing at the end, which we were doing on the way out, walking to dinner, we were cracking up immediately. I mean, just the set of absurd, nested stupidities that caused the whole thing.
And gaping plot holes, like gaping.
Oh, yeah. Oh, God, I wish I could say one of them right now, but I'm holding back.
I bet it's the same one.
I just felt like the tonal shift from the controlled, tense, fidgety, anxious first half into the like operatic second half didn't work for me at all. And then I will also just say Satanism is so fucking boring. Like when I do suck it up and go see a horror movie for the purposes of this show, it's because it's sort of resonant or popped through in some way, like Midsommar, which was so visually striking and weird and made brightness scary instead of the gloaming, which I liked. And then there was Megan last summer, which I think is the last time that a horror movie really popped through and you felt like everyone had to talk about it. And that one was my favorite kind of horror movie where it's, gesturing towards whatever we're going through as a society right now. And I'm not sure Megan actually had a ton of smart ideas about artificial intelligence embedded within it, but it exploited our anxieties about those things very deftly. Whereas, she's like, circling 666 in a note in like minute 20. And you're just like, snooze-a-roo. Like, that's not the boogeyman that interests me to the degree that any boogeyman ever interests me, which they never do, because I never want to go to the movies to be scared. So I will stipulate that my critique comes through that filter, but it's just not the kind of film I want to see. Can you guys talk a little bit about the filmmaking here, though, Dana? Like, I do think this director has been coming in for a lot of praise, making smaller films over the last few years, and has a couple more in the pipeline. We've talked a lot about kind of the plot and the story, but I'm curious what you thought of the direction of the piece.
Oh, I've never seen any of Osgood Perkin's earlier films, so I can't really speak to that. I mean, all I felt here, and I know at least one of my viewing companions strongly agreed with me and had the same feelings at the same time, is sort of what I said earlier, is that like if every single visual and auditory signifier is there to invoke scariness, then my scary sense just shuts down completely. I mean, a person driving down the highway, right, had to be filmed with eerie organ chords and some sort of slow zoom to make you feel unsettled. And that happening at every single moment, to me, just became a stylistic tick. So yes, I think Osgood Perkins understands. He seems to be steeped in the world of horror movies and understand horror tropes, right? And the Silence of the Lambs homage is there. It's a deliberate homage, which, as you say, Steve, does nothing to make this film look any better and only points up its deficiencies in comparison to that movie. But yeah, the moment at the end of Silence of the Lambs when Clarice has to go into the dark house, right, with the night vision glasses, with the gun, something similar to that happens 2 to 3 times within the first hour of the movie. All this Micah Monroe chick does is go alone into houses with a gun and look for a bad guy.
Without ever calling for backup.
Right? So
what the fuck?
So in a sense, this is sort of what I was saying about if you're a new horror viewer, right? And then those things are working on you for the first time or an early time, when you haven't seen many iterations of that. Yes, it sort of gets your adrenaline juices doing the thing they're supposed to do when you're afraid that some person is about to be, found in a dark house, walking creepily around with a gun looking for someone. But that's very, very different from, as you were saying, Steve, what Silence of the Lambs actually does, which is create 2 believably troubled characters in a believable universe that includes people like Scott Glenn, the boss, right? Like, we haven't even talked about the Blair Underwood character, who's the boss, the FBI boss of the protagonist, who makes no sense as a character as well. Is just a complete contrivance for what he needs to be at the moment. Like, there should be a contrast, right, between, Julia, what you're calling the first half of the movie, kind of a crime procedural, like FBI agents try to figure out a crazy, Zodiac Code style serial killer series of murders. And then the second half, or maybe last third of the movie, which is more like, ooh, freaky deaky, possibly supernatural things are afoot. Now it's getting weird. But everything feels supernatural weird, including people sitting down in an FBI office looking through files, right? So the tone is just completely undifferentiated.
Yeah. I will say, although it is very obvious what will become of Blair Underwood's character as her boss from the moment that you meet him, and you are not wrong in what you suspect. I did enjoy seeing Blair Underwood play like a slightly bad dude, like just kind of a, flirting with people who aren't his wife, talking about the old ball and chain. Like, I just feel like every time he's on screen, he plays like a noble prince of high moral fiber. So I did enjoy that deviation in the Blair Underwood canon. That was one little high note for me. All right. Well, the film is Longlegs. Lots of people went to see it. Maybe you've been to see it. If you loved it or hated it or have thoughts on why it went viral, send them to us at culturefest@slate.com.
This is the picture that brings you past the brink of terror, face to face with the most monstrous creation of them all.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Hey, listeners, whether you love true crime, comedies, celebrity interviews, news, or motivational speakers, or all the above, you call the shots on what's in your podcast queue, right? Guess what? Now you can call the shots on your auto insurance as well. Enter the Name Your Price tool from Progressive. The Name Your Price tool puts you in charge of your auto insurance by working just the way it sounds. You tell Progressive how much you want to pay for car insurance. Then they'll show you a variety of coverages that fit within your budget, giving you options. Now that's something you'll want to press play on. It's easy to start a quote, and you'll be able to choose the best option for you fast. It's just one of the many ways you can save with Progressive Insurance. Quote today at Progressive.com to try the Name Your Price tool for yourself and join the over 28 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
Have you heard who the latest power couple is? Well, you won't see this coming. It's Discover and Cash Back. Feeling let down? You won't be when you hear how Discover automatically doubles the cash back earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cashback Match. All with no sign-up required and no limit to how much they'll match. See? Isn't that a couple you want to root for? Get rewarded no matter who you are or how much you spend with Discover. See terms at discover.com/creditcard.
Steve, I believe you have our business today.
I do, Julia. We have some exciting new news for Slate Plus members. We are upgrading your subscriber benefits. Starting today, we're going to be giving you weekly bonus episodes. These bonus episodes will be the new home for extended segments and other subscriber-exclusive content. This week, we did something fun. We tend to have a really rollicking time when we do this. We had so much more to say about the movie Longlegs, much or most of which would require spoiling the movie, that we've decided to make that our bonus episode today. And I guarantee you we are going to have a fun time because we have a lot on our minds about that, the absurdities of that movie. If you're not a Slate Plus member, I'm afraid I have some stern words for you. You should be a Slate Plus member. Get behind the paywall. It's fun there. We're having fun. FOMO. You want to be behind the Slate Plus paywall. You can sign up today at slate.com/culture plus. Members get ad-free podcasts. And here's the really great part. You get lots of bonus content like the Slate Plus segment that I just mentioned. We have a lot. I have to say, Dana, it's a little more freewheeling and we have a lot of fun on the Plus segment.
If you want to hear us really let our hair down and be extremely dumb, that's the place.
You'll get to hear members-only programming on other Slate shows like Slow Burn and the Political Gabfest. Members get unlimited access to all the great writing on Slate.com. You will never hit a paywall if you're a Slate Plus member. That's pretty great. No ads, no paywalls, no nothing. I should also mention that you'll be supporting our work and the work of our brilliant colleagues. These are endangered times. We need journalism to thrive. Memberships are really important to Slate. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts by clicking Try Free at the top of our show page, or visit slate.com/culture plus to get access wherever you listen.
America's Sweethearts, Dallas Cowboys Cheerleaders is a Netflix doc-series from Greg Whiteley, the creator of Cheer, Last Chance U, and other riveting, well-made sports documentaries. Here, though, he tells the stories not of overlooked underdogs, but of icons of American femininity, tracing veterans and rookies as they compete for the 36 spots on the team and make their way through an NFL season. Before we dig into the question of whether this is a puff piece or a lacerating expose, let's listen to a clip. We'll hear veteran cheerleader Victoria, who, like all veterans, has to fight to re-earn her place on the team, asking for some feedback from Coach Kelly Finglass on her auditions so far.
I wanted to ask just what y'all think of me. You know you're talented. You know you're beautiful.
In a broad stroke, I don't think you had the same stamina as 18, 19-year-old Victoria.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Just strength. I mean, we're used to
Yeah.
you could leap and go to heaven and back, even in the kicks. I would say stamina. So if
Okay.
you're working on that, that's great.
No, yes.
But make sure you have enough fuel and enough energy.
Okay, I know I started with Dana last time, but I feel like as the most Texan adjacent person on this call, as the plausible Texan of the call, I'm also going to start with her with apologies to you, Steve. So Dana, can you explain what, if any, role the Dallas Cowboys cheerleaders played in your head in your childhood and what you made of this film?
I mean, in a way, it would have made sense to start with Steve as the football guy, because I feel like my relationship to this is less as a football watcher or anybody who knows anything about the Dallas Cowboys, except in that I always perceive them as sort of the evil team, the way the New York Yankees is like the evil team, that has the most money and power.
Correct to do so.
But as a complete non-football watcher who, as I've mentioned before in the show, grew up in a big public high school that was a total football cult, as most big Texas public high schools are, I kind of understood this. I don't know. This seemed to me like a documentary about a bunch of hostages who didn't realize they were being kept hostage in a way. And it made me think about not so much football and the role it played in my childhood, but femininity as understood in my childhood or the place and time I grew up. But apparently still in this place and time now, at least if you're a Dallas Cowboy cheerleader. Like early on, I believe in the very first episode, we get this big reveal that to me undercut every moment that came after, of which, by the way, there were too many moments because, like most Netflix docs, this did not need to be 7 hours long. But this revelation that we get in the first episode, that the cheerleaders are horribly paid. We don't learn what their actual salary is, but we learn that almost all of them have day jobs. Like literally they work in, healthcare, or one's an orthodontist, or, one of them is, I can't remember, studying to get her degree in something. They have full work days, and then they report to the stadium and work out until midnight and then get up and do it all again, right? And just when you think about the amount of money that's in professional football, the idea that these women are being kept on this tiny salary that one of them compares to what you might make for working full-time at Chick-fil-A, right? I would love to know what the actual number is, and they never tell us. I'm sure it's possible to find out. But that, to me, made the entire documentary sort of like a secret movie about labor and, and exploitation. Although that doesn't come up a lot more times in the doc, because the whole idea is, well, it's such an honor and it's so important and wonderful to be a Dallas Cowboys cheerleader that, in fact, of course, the money doesn't really matter to them. Well, the person who's saying that is the brand ambassador and the daughter of the owner of the Cowboys, right? So all I could think the whole time was, wow, they have to look absolutely perfect, have bodies like literal Barbie dolls, be unbelievable precision athletes, be paid practically zero, have borderline eating disorders, and be constantly critiqued for everything they do. Like, why is this life desirable? It's desirable because of the fantasy of femininity that they have all bought into and that's being aggressively sold to them at every moment. So I think I was watching it in this very sort of fist in the air, like feminist labor leader way that made it hard to get into the reality show side of it, of just sort of like, what's so-and-so's trajectory going to be? And will she get cut from the team? I recommend that people watch it in that it's an incredible glimpse into a world that you otherwise wouldn't get a glimpse into. But I don't think that this documentary is as cutting and smart and incisive as it needs to be about the labor practices and the exploitation of these women. It lingers a lot over the kind of fetishization of the clothes they wear. I mean, I'm not going to say that it's a leering documentary. I don't think it is. But, there's just a lot of sort of long, loving shots of the beautiful, clean football field that they're about to run out to, and long, loving shots of their white hot pants hung on hangers in the dressing room and things. And I think that it kind of buys into the idealization of like, aren't these women incredible? And, they are incredible in terms of their athleticism and the amount of work they do. But the idea that this is what we're holding up as sort of a model of femininity seems to me in 2024 really damaging and sad.
Steve, come at it as our NFL fan, and as possibly someone who was growing up as an NFL fan in the era that these cheerleaders began to storm America. Right, their history traces back to the 70s, and then they kept evolving in dominance through the 80s, 90s. So, what do you make of this project?
Right. As I understand it, they existed in the 60s or came into existence in the 60s, but they became a marketing phenomenon, I think, in the mid-70s. And that was an innovation that coincided exactly with the onset of puberty for me. And the innovation there was multifold, but it was to turn NFL cheerleaders into kind of Playboy bunnies and then brand them as such and massively leverage it up as an independent business, which they did quite successfully. What I mean by that is they were there to perform sexy in a very basic way, provocatively but safely. It's designed to affirm the masculine primacy of the male customer without overly infuriating the wife who might be sitting next to him on the sofa. Like, I think that's kind of where it was slotted. I say this non-judgmentally. I think there's plenty of judgmental things to say about it, but I'm just trying to understand it as a phenomenon. So in some sense, this ideal got kind of inside of me. I mean, I'm like a 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grader. These posters are everywhere. They're appearing on the Love Boat, but they become celebrities in their own right, but anonymous, like as a group, as a core. I was very interested in it for that reason, my own relationship to a female ideal that, one kind of finds inculcated in one, maybe slightly against one's own will before one knows what is happening, and then gets expunged as one grows up. I also was very eager to watch it because somehow the person who directed it, as Julia said, directed Cheer plus DCC, Dallas Cowboy Cheerleaders, seemed like an inspired pairing. It's very matter of fact and weirdly non-judgmental. It does do what Dana says. It has a loving aspect to it. But in a way, I got something out of this ambivalence. I enjoy watching any procedural about something that demands total excellence, commitment, a degree of selflessness, craft, and as a consequence develops a true esprit de corps. And on the other hand, it brings home in a slightly horrifying way that a plurality, if not a majority of this country regards the Dallas Cowboy Cheerleaders as gender-affirming therapy, right? There's some really, in our liberal bubble, transcended notion of gender and gender roles that other people find enormously reassuring. And what to make of that is very hard to understand. These are the highly gendered female opposite of highly gendered football players. They pair with that. And I know much more unequivocally how I feel about the culture of football and football players. It's revolting. They get paid many tens of thousands of times what these women get paid, and yet they too are getting chewed up and spat out by a totally ruthless multi-billion-dollar corporate enterprise that cares nothing for them as human beings. The number of people who actually walk away having made decent money and with something like their body and mind still intact from NFL football is diminishingly small relative to the number who actually play professional football. But I want to say that I want to say, it's kind of boring, it's kind of riveting, but there are two really, to my mind, interesting characters, and they contrast with one another quite beautifully. Reese and Victoria, about whom I assume we'll all have more to say.
Yeah, I mean, I want to push back, Dana, on the idea that this documentary needed to do more overt economic fist waving. Like, I think that this is just a devastating portrait of how exploited these women are. And I don't think that's an accident. And I don't think it's an accident that we get the information that we do about what they're paid right there at the top of the series. And I mean, the director, Greg Whiteley, claims that he had editorial control of the doc. I'm sure he must have had some amount of editorial control. He said that he initially declined the offer to do it because he assumed that he wouldn't have the kind of control he wanted. And, we do see clips throughout the series of, there was kind of a cheesier Making the Team type series that ran for many, many years in the more classic reality show mold. And this is very different from that. But I actually thought in the filmmaking, in the editing, in the choice of shots, in the portrait of these women, in the way in which they're come to be understood and portrayed as subjects. There's a lot of beautiful, subtle, suggestive visual storytelling that I found totally captivating and totally heartbreaking, and a really revealing portrait of why people participate, sometimes enthusiastically, in their own exploitation. And the economics of the possibility of that exploitation are right there. There are hundreds of women who want to do this for every available seat. And there are dozens, at least, who could plausibly do it for every available seat. And those are the conditions in which exploitation can continue. But just like these very subtle choices, there's one contender, Anna Kate, who is the younger sister of a woman who's been a DCC, as they call themselves, for several years, and then retires in part because she hits her 5 years, and in part because she has absolutely destroyed her hips and body doing jump splits and a number of other elastic movements. And this younger sister seems totally ambivalent about the prospect of becoming a DCC. And she doesn't talk about it much, but the camera will linger on her face at these moments of terror. And there's an incredible shot when you see her beginning to realize that she's might actually make it through this process, where she just seems full of dread. That is beautiful. Like, I loved that this was a show don't tell documentary. And I actually think, it is weird that they don't actually just say what they're paid. Maybe the subjects were told not to say what they're paid, but it certainly could have deployed a little bit more reportorial heft in that regard. On the other hand, you pretty clearly get the picture. And the woman who tells us how much she was paid is someone who is no longer a DCC, was a couple years ago, is a woman of color, of whom there are not that many, but there are some. And I don't know. I found myself frustrated with the reviews that suggested that this was all lionization and iconography. I think the portrait of trappedness is pretty consciously made.
Julia, I want to push back a little bit, because I think everything you say is true. But how much does it require our gender epistemology, with its assumption of false consciousness, to make this argument? It is true. I thought the reason I point to Reese and Victoria is Reese is like lab grown, apparently, to be a Dallas Cowboy cheerleader. She seems to love it. She's endlessly perky. She's untrying to the people in every micro interaction. She does not try the patience of the people she's with. Quite the opposite. And she appears to love it. Who are we to say that Reese has somehow been placed inside a Procrustean gender box if she regards this as her journey and her personal liberation? It's not easy to make that argument in the face of someone's apparent happiness and fulfillment. Who are we to say on her behalf that she's somehow been amputated from her best possible or most liberated self? I don't know how to do that. Maybe it's possible to do that. But then there is the portrait of Victoria, and Victoria is the one who's she's vocal about her ambivalence. She had a mother who was in it and clearly took her life identity from having been a Dallas Cowboy cheerleader. This woman's now entering, at the beginning of the show, her 4th year. You age out after 5. It endlessly plays on all of her insecurities about her weight, her looks, her abilities, her inability to be her mother, and her inability to emerge as a Reese figure, as a flawlessly perfect, like born to be this cheerleader type archetype. And her entire arc is excruciating. And I don't want to give anything away, but to me, one of the big payoffs of the documentary is a very key moment in the final episode with her that is utterly heartbreaking. And the documentary you describe is on display in exactly that moment. Like, how does this person say that, given what we've seen play out on her face? On the other hand, there are other women, Kelsey and Reese in particular, for whom this appears to be utterly fulfilling, and their entire lives, in some sense, are foreign to our expectations about what self-fulfillment should be. But who are we to tell them they're wrong?
I'm not trying to tell them they're wrong, and I don't think the documentary is, and I think it would be a worse documentary if it was. What I like about it is that it portrays the economic exploitation and the ludicrosity of it. I think it's sincere in its desire to understand what makes these women do this.
Oh, then we agree.
What makes any woman perform femininity in whatever ways she does. You know, and we're all susceptible. I didn't grow up in it, you know, the Dallas Cowboys cheerleaders barely registered in my growing up, and yet it's completely captivating to see them toss their hair with pom-poms. Like, why? I don't know. It just is.
Yeah. We totally agree. I misunderstood what you were saying. I think it's both documentaries, which is why it's actually fascinating.
I agree with you, Dana, that it's long and gets a little baggy, but I think it does a lot of good work.
Yeah, you know, a note I made and something that kept occurring to me, especially when Victoria was on screen, and she was, you know, I think maybe the most ambivalent, conflicted, interesting of the current cheerleader set, was America Ferrera's speech in Barbie that everyone made fun of at the time. Remember her speech? It's impossible to be a woman. They tell you to be this. They tell you to be that. It's all self-contradictory. And that was a much derided and critiqued moment in Barbie because everybody sort of said it's so on the nose and everyone knows that already. Well, I mean, this show seems to unfold, at times at least, within the consciousness of people who are living that exact contradiction, right? That everything you do is wrong. You're too scrawny. You don't fit the uniform. Now you're too fat. Oh, you're working too hard. I can see it on your face. But wait, you're not working hard enough. You know, if you listen to these two women, Kelly and Judy, who were the former cheerleaders, who were the coaches and trainers and, you know, who basically pick and run the team, they're just, it really is this kind of impossible to satisfy mother, you know, who's going to love you in just a second as soon as you're a little bit more perfect.
A little more perfect. Even if every single one of those 36 women who make it are totally fulfilled and ecstatic, they are forcing that ideal on all the women in America who are forced to watch it and participate in that culture, who cannot live up to that ideal or even close. So the cost of it may not be reflected in those 36.
All right. Well, there's a lot to chew over in the documentary, possibly too much. It's America's Sweethearts, Dallas Cowboys Cheerleaders on Netflix. Greg Whiteley has left open the door to subsequent seasons in his various interviews. So we shall see if we return to this group of jump-splitting hopefuls.
This podcast is brought to you by Slate Studios and SAP. AI is moving so fast. If you don't get reliable and relevant advice, your business might miss out. Welcome to Dear Artie, an advice column from SAP, where we tackle the tricky questions at the intersection of AI and business. Here's our expert, the technology futurist, Ian Kahn.
Hi, I'm excited to dive into today's question.
Dear Artie, the supply chain has been a friend and foe to my company. Can AI make us more resilient? Signed, Supply Chained to Uncertainty.
Hey, Supply. Here's how AI in the supply chain can help. AI can massively automate data analytics and understand the movement of your goods. AI can point out weak links, market demand trends, optimal logistics, and other important aspects that impact the top and bottom lines for the business. Take the example of a large grocery chain that has hundreds of vendors spread through the country. In some cases, you may need to reroute shipments to other stores, such as in the case of fresh produce, a good that can go bad very fast. Managing such a supply chain is heavily dependent on the data provided, and AI can help optimize this information so that your supply chain works at its optimal levels.
Embrace AI with confidence. Head to sap.com/AI to learn more.
This episode is brought to you by ZBiotics. Let's face it, after a night with drinks, it's tough to bounce back the next day. You have to make a choice. You can either have a great night or a great next day. ZBiotics is a surefire way to wake up feeling fresh after a night of drinking. ZBiotics pre-alcohol probiotic drink is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. It's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. ZBiotics produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. Just remember to make ZBiotics your first drink of the night, drink responsibly, and you'll feel your best tomorrow. Go to zbiotics.com/slate to get 15% off your first order when you use SLATE at checkout. ZBiotics is backed with 100% money-back guarantee, so if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember to head to zbiotics.com/slate and use the code SLATE at checkout for 15% off.
In the Toronto Star last week, Alice Munro's daughter, Andrea Skinner, published a devastating personal essay describing her sexual abuse at the hands of her stepfather and how her mother and family ignored and minimized that abuse, even after her stepfather admitted it and was convicted of assault on a minor. The paper also published a journalistic account of the events, including the fact that Skinner and her siblings eventually united to grapple with the abuse and its fallout, and to make a collective decision to go public with this story after their mother's death a few months ago. We've invited dear friend of the program and Slate book critic Laura Miller on the show to grapple with this very difficult story and with how to think about Alice Munro and her work in the wake of it. Laura, thanks so much for joining us.
That's great to be here.
You wrote a wonderful piece for Slate, which we'll get to in a moment. But when you first heard the news, how did that feel?
Well, I mean, I was shocked, like pretty much everybody who's familiar with Alice Munro's work was. I think I maybe didn't revere her as much as some people, so I didn't feel like, betrayed by it. But nevertheless, it's such an extreme story, her indifference to her daughter's suffering, the way that she put this man this second husband who just seems like a completely horrible person before her own child. All of these things were just so out of character with the sort of image in people's minds of Alice Munro, based mostly on her work and its sensitivity and its empathy and its grasp of the complexities of human nature. I think if you go and look at, there's like a handful of stories that seem different in this light and seem to be grappling more with the sort of like almost repressed moral reckoning that she must have gone through, where she surely knew what she was doing was wrong, and yet she did it anyway. But it just feels so buried. And then there are all the sort of ancillary figures, or not even ancillary. Andrea's father, who told her not to tell her mother, the way that Alice Munro was sort of protected from the reality of what was going on for a long time, presumably because of her status as a literary figure. The fact that a lot of people in the Canadian literary scene sort of knew about it or had heard rumors about it, because the guy was actually convicted and he pled guilty and he admitted to it in writing. So there's just no equivocation about it. There's no, I believe Andrea. I mean, you don't have to make the decision to believe Andrea. It's a legal fact that he is guilty. And yet nobody really talked about it. It's such an extreme story, especially in our contemporary understanding. And it just seems so out of character with what people want to believe Alice Munro was.
Yeah, we had a little debate about whether we should talk about this subject this week, in part because so often artists whose work we admire or revere turn out to have done horrible things in their personal lives. And in some ways, the art versus the artist conversation can get a little old or circular or tired. And the particular qualities of Alice Munro's work that make people admire it, to me, made this one feel different. Like it seemed like the exact quality she demonstrates in her stories of being so precise, emotionally precise and clear-eyed about how people interact with each other, made it feel even more confounding than it sometimes does when you learn that an artist is capable of terrible things. And you spoke to that a little bit, but I'm curious, Steve, if you had thoughts on that, processing this news.
Many thoughts. Laura, I loved your piece, especially that I have my copy of Open Secrets here, that you talked about that story, Vandals, which is impossible not to reread in light of this. Truly horrifying. I mean, I haven't read a ton of Munro, but even if you've selected 3 or 4 representative stories, you'd know immediately why she won the Nobel Prize. I mean, I suppose the question is, we revere certain artists because of their utter uniqueness. To be Alison Munro is to be unlike every other writer who ever lived. And that distinctive thing is both their signature and the thing that draws us inexorably toward them. And I think what we're discovering about certain artists in particular, especially those that have clearly a dark streak, I mean, I think Munro did. I think lucidity and clarity, I think you're right, Julia, that's part of what she's doing, but there's a ton of unspoken, suppressed energy. There appears to be a skeleton in every closet. I mean, it's very much a small Canadian rural sensibility of a town in which many people harbor secrets and open secrets. Exactly that. And who's forgiven for what, what's forgotten, what's never forgotten, are interwoven deeply into the, fiction that she created. What makes a person uniquely themselves is what makes them as an artist uniquely brilliant and also uniquely ugly. And it's perhaps their access to that unique ugliness that allows them to depict the darkness that they do. And Laura or Dana, let me say that again, because I want to turn cleanly to Dana. It's her turn to talk. Dana, I'm curious how you feel about this. Like, is it solely an individual a matter of, I mean, ultimately it is, of course, only a matter of individual discretion. We're not going to burn her books, and people aren't going to universally stop reading them. I suppose the question then is, can you listen to How Soon Is Now without hearing Morrissey degrade and insult brown people, or listen to Come Pick Me Up without hearing Ryan Adams coming onto a 14-year-old girl over the internet? And can you read these stories, which are extraordinary, without thinking of her complicity in the near utter destruction of her own daughters' lives?
I mean, in answer to that, in part, I want to talk a little bit more about the story Vandals that Laura mentions, which was in the first collection that Munro published after finding out this news, right? It came out the year after her 25-year-old daughter, Andrea, wrote her this letter revealing for the first time, that she had been abused, and really, laying out the details of it in a way that was pretty graphic and unforgettable, right? But before we get to Vandals, I just wanted to mention Andrea Skinner, the figure of Andrea Skinner as she has emerged, both from the, sort of very confessional piece that she wrote and in the wonderful reported piece in the Toronto Star that she participated in with her siblings, revealing more details. Just how extraordinary she comes across. I mean, first of all, her incredible courage in revealing this, right? And I think something that sets this story apart from a lot of these kinds of stories, especially when they involve children, is that there really is an unsparing amount of detail that's revealed both in her own piece and in the reported story, which, while painful to read, makes the family dynamic so much clearer than in one of those stories that tries to be very discreet and cover things over with euphemisms about, things happened and fondling occurred or something. No, actual body parts are mentioned, right? This sort of duration of this period of harassment, which went beyond, the night of her actual assault to years where she would spend summers with her mother and her stepfather, and he would expose himself and masturbate in front of her and all of these gross things, right? The fact that she has the courage to get past the shame that her family inculcated her with, her mother specifically inculcated her with for decades and decades, to lay out that story, I think will help so many people. Like, what really, really got to me at the end of Andrea Skinner's story was the moment that her siblings come back into her life, right? She'd estranged herself from her mother, and her siblings continued to be in touch with her mother. So she was sort of, outside the family, raising her twins without contact with the family. And at some point, after Gerald Fremlin, the stepfather who perpetrated the abuse, had died, and when Alice Munro was dying, when she had Alzheimer's and was declining, the siblings decided to reach back out to their sister and apologize and, ask for her forgiveness and bring her back into the family. And that image at the end of Andrea Skinner's piece of the siblings standing together, and they're gathered at a place that is for sexual abuse survivors to tell their stories, right? This place called the Gatehouse, was incredibly moving to me. And these stories so seldom end with anything like a fragment of redemption. And in this case, it seemed like because of Andrea Skinner's incredible courage and because of her siblings, ability to reach beyond what they had been inculcated with their whole lives, there may be a kind of happy ending for these siblings. But Laura, can you talk a tiny bit about the story Vandals in the collection Open Secrets, which I see Steve has sitting right here on the desk next to him? I haven't read the story, but it seems like an almost incredible case of a writer. I mean, the secret is barely open. The skeleton is in a closet, but the closet has a beaded curtain, it sounds like, right? You can practically read what happened right there on the page.
Yeah, this story was published in the New Yorker the year after Alice Munro received Andrea Skinner's letter explaining what had happened to her and what her second husband had done. And it's worth pointing out that when Alice Munro learned this, she received it in this way that Andrea sort of expected but hoped wouldn't happen, which was like as an infidelity, which seems really crazy. Who has an infidelity with an 8-year-old? But she left him for a while, and then she came back to him and told one of her other children that she just couldn't live without him, which is just such a bizarre thing to imagine. It's a story that begins with a thank you note from this older woman named B, whose partner, Lardner, has just died. And she's thanking a young woman who came to check on their house in the country while she and Lardner were at the hospital. And the house has been trashed, and this has been blamed on teenagers. As the story goes along, we learn that, in fact, the younger woman, Liza, has herself trashed the house along with her husband. And then we get flashbacks to her childhood when she would visit the sort of self-styled nature preserve that Lardner maintained around this house and play around and actually be molested by Lardner, and how she hoped when B came into Lardner's life that she would somehow put a stop to this, but that did not happen. And, the way I'm describing it makes it sound like the abuse is like the major focus of the story, but really the major focus of the story is what B sees in Lardner versus what Liza sees in him, and why she was drawn to him. And it is a kind of a strange and mysterious attraction because he is very surly and almost indifferent to her, as you might expect from someone who is a pedophile. But somehow she finds this just irresistible. And it's hard not to see that as reflecting on Alice Munro's relationship with Gerard Fremlin, because, he just comes across as so horrid in these letters that he wrote to Andrea's father and stepmother, blaming her for the abuse and calling her a homewrecker and a Lolita and all these other things. He just seems like the most repellent figure. And you have to wonder, given how repellent the character Lardner is in this story, if it isn't sort of her bizarre explanation for why she was so attached to him.
I was going to go back and read that story, especially after your powerful explication of it, which I would send our readers to on Slate. And then I decided to just read a story at random, a story that has that doesn't necessarily seem to have a veiled connection to this terrible family secret, just to remind myself what it is I admire in her fiction. But I think that sense that on some level she knew and was processing it through her art makes it all the worse, makes her ability to see into the darkness of herself even less excusable, not that it ever could be.
In a way, it's ultimately even more unfathomable when you read a story like Vandals and you realize that it was just her bizarre passion for this man that somehow made her unable to see him clearly, or at least to sort of make the decision that needed to be made, to be a different sort of woman, which is how Liza refers to B, because it's not like he was abusing her and she was afraid, or she was financially dependent on him. She was a very, very prominent literary figure. And, when people say, how could she do this thing? It's almost even more just confounding, because she wasn't vulnerable in the way that we're used to thinking of women in relationships with abusive men. And yet somehow she could not leave this guy.
Yeah, that maybe is another angle of this story that makes it feel different from a lot of stories of abuse where we're usually hearing about the victim's relationship to the abuser and not having it circuited through this third party who is actually your mother, which makes it all the more horrifying.
All right. Well, if you have not yet read Andrea Skinner's essay in the Toronto Star, you should. It's a powerful piece of work. It's called My Stepfather Sexually Abused Me When I Was a Child. My mother, Alice Munro, chose to stay with him. Laura, thank you so much for joining and talking a bit about this story and Munro's work.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Wildcard is a new podcast that asks big questions you won't hear anywhere else. Famous guests like Jenny Slate, Chris Pine, and Bowen Yang have to answer whatever question gets drawn from a special deck of cards. What's a goal you're glad you gave up on? What's a belief you had to let go of?
Oh.
What's the biggest sacrifice you've ever made? Listen to Wildcard wherever you get your podcasts, only from NPR.
Now is the moment in our show when we endorse Stephen. You go first.
Julia, I think I will. This is like such a pleasurable callback to one of the all-time greatest endorsements in the show's history, which I believe was yours before it was mine, right? Aren't you the reason that I know about Dodie Smith and I Capture the Castle?
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. And this is a cornerstone of both of my children's childhood. I read the book cover to cover for each of them when they were growing up at the moment they seemed ready for it. And boy, were they ever. I love that book to death. It's one of my probably 5 or 8 favorite novels written in English.
Yes, endorsement
and
landed.
It's one of the greatest. I just think it's one of the great novels of the 20th century. Full stop. And I had, not to center myself now, because this is really about someone else's essay about it, but let me put it this way, is Anna Leskowitz, whose name I might be mispronouncing, is editor and writer at The New Statesman, has written an essay for the New York Review of Books called The Small Girl's Proust. And it's a wonderful essay in its own right, but the fact is it argues something that I felt like I understood intuitively, but couldn't articulate. And so it's that profound gratitude, not only for reading something good, but for having something you had an inchoate set of intellectual sensations about, to see someone bring them to the surface. It begins with the wonderful lead sentence. One of the worst moments of Dodie Smith's life was when her debut novel became a bestseller. Smith regarded herself as an heiress to Joyce and Proust, which is what I felt about the book too, is that clearly came after the modernist developments of fiction in the first half of the century, principally by Joyce and Proust. She did not feel as though she'd written a girl's book or what we would now call a young adult book, or a comfort read, as all the condescending reviews called it. And so here she was with this mammoth success. It was a bigger commercial success at the time that I understood in the United States and England. And yet she felt like everyone had misunderstood the book, with one wonderful exception, at least alluded to in the essay, which is she was friends with Christopher Isherwood. She was a fairly well-known playwright, which I didn't know, and was part of pretty upper literary circles as a consequence of it. And she was worried that everyone in that circle, particularly Isherwood, would misunderstand it and treat it as a quote-unquote girl's book. Isherwood really understood it. Actually, just let me read his quote. It's so wonderful. Dodie imagined what her friend Isherwood would make of it. Quote, quite apart from what will seem to him the triviality of my story, its extreme femininity will bore him. And that's not what happened. Wonderfully, he wrote to her and said, like a really good carving, the more you look at it, the more you see. It's full of meanings, but under the surface, not rammed in the reader's face. Very much lived in by many people because you can live inside it, like Dickens. He really loved it and admired it. It's a beautiful essay about one of my favorite works of literature that is, to this day, misunderstood, I think, even by people who cherish it. So what a wonderful act of reputation correction and really restitution. So the essay, we'll link to it, of course, is called The Small Girl's Proust by Anna, and I'm probably mispronouncing your last name, Leskowitz. And we'll link to it. And please check it out. And read the book if you haven't read it.
Amazing. All right. That is truly the endorsement that keeps on giving. Although I thought you were going to talk about sliced bread, Steve. Dana, what is your endorsement this week?
My endorsement is related to a topic that we almost did this week. When Shelley Duvall died last week, we had a discussion in our topics call. Should we cover Shelley Duvall? I think in a different week we might have, but given that we had just done an obituary segment for Donald Sutherland, I think maybe we just, in the interest of not becoming the obit per week show, which would be sad, we decided to not talk about Shelley particularly. But I swore to myself I would spend the weekend thinking about her, researching her, watching her, and bringing something back for other people to experience about Shelley Duvall that they might not know already. And what I came across is a little tribute to her that was made by the Austin Film Society 2 years ago when they celebrated her life and work. The Austin Film Society is this wonderful place. If you don't know anything about it, it was founded by Richard Linklater back in the 80s, and it's a nonprofit film organization that's also a great movie theater that's completely decorated with Richard Linklater's private poster collection. It's just a really, really great place to go see a movie. I got to go there during my book tour and show a Buster Keaton film. Anyway, they also kind of give awards and recognize figures in film. Shelley Duvall, being a Texan who was living in Texas at the time, was a natural person for them to recognize. And when they gave her this little award and honored her, they also made a 3-minute clip reel of Shelley Duvall's career. And so that's what I'm endorsing, but I'm endorsing it in the hopes that when you watch this really, really well-made clip reel that sort of traces some of the highlights of her career, and unlike many clip reels, labels the movies that it's talking about. So instead of just giving a vibe, it actually shows you what movie you could go watch, right? I'm hoping that in watching this wonderful little piece put together by the Austin Film Society, people will go and watch some of those movies. It sent me down a road I hadn't seen. Her very first movie, Brewster McCloud, which was an early Robert Altman movie, sort of before he became the Robert Altman of Nashville
This
and
is the Astrodome?
darling of Pauline Kael. It's like a kind of a...
The boy living in the Astrodome, or isn't he?
Yeah. It's with Bud Cort, right? With
Bud
Bud
Cort,
Cort
yeah,
and
yeah.
Shelley Duvall. I don't want to give away too much, but yes, it involves someone living in the Houston Astrodome, and it's just a very oddball, little low budget, even for Robert Altman, low budget movie, which Shelley Duvall makes her debut in. And of course, the story of Robert Altman discovering her when she wasn't even an actor is another whole separate great story, and the ongoing relationship they would have. She appeared in so many of his movies and was so perfect for his sensibility. But anyway, if not for the clips shown in this little Austin Film Society tribute, I might not have gone down the road of watching Brewster McCloud this weekend, which is a great movie. So that's my endorsement. Watch this little clip. We'll link to it on the show page, and then find some Shelley Duvall movie that you haven't seen or maybe haven't heard of and go watch it.
Oh, I love that, Dana. What a great endorsement. I come back from my international travels with thoughts on global candy. So I have 2 endorsements here. One is that I was able to spend some time on my trip in Norway, which is an absolutely amazing place to visit. It's like a cross between Maine and Hawaii in terms of the flora and the topography. And I strongly recommend checking it out if you are at all interested in fjords. But the national candy of Norway, I learned, is something called Kvikk, spelled Kvikk, new word, Lunsj, which I think translates to quick lunch. And it's essentially a Kit Kat, but it's like a hiking Kit Kat. And in the culture of Norway, as I came to understand it during a very brief time there, and please Norwegian listeners or Norway adjacent listeners, tell me what I've gotten wrong here. But as it was explained to me by various Norwegians I met, this is like kind of has the reputation within Norway that maybe a Snickers does in the US as like the hearty, sporty candy. And they're frequently given out when you're skiing. And on the inside of the wrapper is printed in Norwegian, the Norwegian Mountain Code. And typically these are given around Easter, I guess, when people are on like ski trips. And so the Norwegian Mountain Code, which I will not try to read in Norwegian, has things like, plan your trip and inform others about the route you have selected. Adapt the planned routes according to ability and conditions. Pay attention to the weather and the avalanche warnings. So I love the idea of this like virtuous little snow candy. Also, as I went to learn more about it, they were like, people in Norway eat so much of this candy. The average Norwegian eats 9 a year. I was like, 9 a year? I probably eat 9 Kit Kats a year, and I don't even like Kit Kat that much.
That's so
anyway,
perfect.
So that's Kvikk, which is one of those things, once you learn it, you'll see it everywhere. I was reading a Joe Nesbo thriller while I was there, just to heighten the ambiance. The Norwegian crime writer, and sure enough, there's a Kvikk mention. Then from Norway, I was fortunate enough to go to Denmark, where I had a wonderful day with Slate podcast OG photographer. I don't know if we have a acronym for Steve McFarlane, Steve Metcalf, but I think he's the OP, original photographer of the program.
Opfop, it's just staring you in the face. Opfop.
Okay, Opfop. He now lives in Denmark with his lovely family, and my family hung out with them for a bit, had a wonderful afternoon, and they introduced us to the Danish tradition of fredagslik. Do you guys know what fredagslik is?
I'm trying to get it from the sound of the word. I have no idea.
It will slightly come through. So apparently, Danes will tell you, I learned, that Denmark consumes more candy per capita than any other country in the world. I did not verify this, but it is definitely something that the Danes believe to be true about themselves. And they have a custom on Fridays, which I guess is fredagslick, which is the family going to the penny candy store at the end of the arduous school week, and everybody in the family, not just the kids, getting like a bag of penny candy. And so our families went together to their local candy store in Norrebro and had so much fun putting on little plastic gloves and, getting weird Norwegian licorice shaped like rubbery Ferraris. And anyway, candy, International Candy Report concluded. Anyway, what fun. Candy adventures. There were other cultural explorations as well. It was not exclusively a candy-based bit of tourism, but I wanted to share the news of Kvikklunch and fredagslick with apologies in my pronunciation and interpretations of these cultures and languages. Please correct me, Norwegians, Danes, any Swedes out there who want to chime in with Swedish candy traditions, didn't make it to Sweden. Sorry to leave you guys out of the Scandi Candy report. We'll have to report back later. All right, you will find links to some of the things we talked about today on our show page. That's slate.com/culturefest. And you can email us at culturefest@slate.com. Our introductory theme music is by the composer Nicolas Cage. Our production assistant is Kat Hong, and our producer is Jared Downing. For Dana Stevens and Stephen Metcalf, I'm Julia Turner. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week.
Pulling up to Mickey D's just for drinks? Oh yeah, that's me. Nothing extra, just perfection and a straw. Coming in hot for the coldest cups on the block. Because there are drinks. Then there are drinks from McDonald's.
Mix things up with any size lemonade or sweet tea for $1.49. Perfect with our classic fries. Price and participation may vary. Cannot be combined with any other offer.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.